Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We will begin with our prayer to be followed by the national anthem. May we request everyone to put yourselves in the presence of our Almighty God. Let us put ourselves in the presence of God. God Almighty, thank you for bringing us together to celebrate Cebuano culture and heritage through the sharing of our stories. We need this in this time of uncertainty, O God, to remind us of our identity as a people, unique and blessed and proud. This reminder must inspire us that whatever challenges we face, whether unseen, alien, and treacherous, can always be overcome if we are united in working for the present and the future, and for the heritage of our children and community. We pray for our present-day heroes who are fighting against the virus, as well as other threats that besiege us today. For our own people struggling to overcome these threats, and for those who have died, fallen, but never forgotten. Dearest God, heal our land. Amen.
Mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
Kayang magiging helas ng sinangalan, alam ng puso, sa titik mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, tuyag ka ng magiting, sa manlulupin, di ka pasisingil, sa nagatang tutok sa simoy at sa langit mong bagaw, ay hinatang tula, kawin sa pagkayang minamahal. Ang isang ng matawad mo'y tagumpay na nag-iimig, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may di magtitingin. Lupa ng araw ng walhagin pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Ang inigaya na pagkay mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Maayong hapon mga Cebuanon. Welcome to Gabii sa Kabilin 2021 online activities. This is an engaging space to appreciate and experience Cebu's culture and heritage.
Open our GSK webinar this afternoon is the Secretary of the Department of Education, Secretary Leonor Mirasol Briones.
Mayong hapon ka natong tanan sa ngalan sa Department of Education, ilabi na gayod sa Region 7 Department of Education. Kami nagahimamat o congratulate sa Culture and Heritage Unit sa Ramon Aboitiz Foundation niining inyong organize nga Gabii sa Kabilin. Congratulations tungod kay ako, pareho ninyo nagtuo nga dili lamang nato celebrate ang atong independence, ang atong Philippine Revolution against Spain by the usual celebratory activities, pero ako na nanggi sulti dugay-dugay na ang kinahanglan aduna pud kitay mga fora, mga webinars kung diin atong debatihon, atong istoryahon ang lain-lain nga bahin sa atong kasaysayan bilang Pilipino, bilang mga Bisaya, bilang taga Cebu o bilang taga Negros man. Ako nakabisita nako sa Ramon Aboitiz Foundation. Uban pa na akong pamilya, akong duha ka anak, ang akong bana ug ang akong ako ginako aron aduna sila'y ideya ug unsay nahitabo pananglitan sa Cebu ug sa ubang parte sa atong nasod sa panahon sa revolusyon. Dili lamang sa revolusyon, kundi ang atong kultura, ang atong kasaysayan ni atong mga panahona. So, congratulations. Dako usab ang akong kalipay, ang akong himamaton si Dr. Resil Mojares, usa ka inila o respetado nga scholar, dili lamang sa history sa atong nasod, hindi lamang sa history sa Cebu o unsay nahitabo sa revolusyon sa laban o kontra sa mga katsila o sa mga Pilipino, kundi daghang aspeto sa atong kultura o sa atong kasaysayan usab. Kami ni Dr. Resil, dugay-dugay na kaming magkaila, pero out of touch kami pila ka tuig na. Dili man kinahanglan nga pareho ang ideya sa mga scholar, sa mga nagtuon sa atong kasaysayan o unsay nahitabo sa atong nasod, unsay analysis sa atong politika. Di man kinahanglan nga pareho tanan ang atong ideya. Ang importante nga magrespetuhay kita. Dako kayang akong respeto kang Dr. Resil. Karon lamang bag-o gani may ning duol kanako nga usa ka grupo sa mga movie makers nga gusto nilang mo himo og pelikula mahitungod kang sa kinabuhi ni Lapu-Lapu ug sa sitwasyon sa Cebu ug sa Visayas ni atong panahon nga wala pa moabot ang mga katsila o sa panahon sa revolusyon. Akong giingon sila nga dili ako ang angay nilang duolon o pangutan-on ug unsay nahitabo. Ang maayo gud nga duolon si Dr. Resil Mojares tungod kay sa akong tan-aw ang pinaka-definitive nga pagtuon, pag-analyze sa kinabuhi, sa myth, sa reality, sa mga istorya-istorya kabahin kang Lapu-Lapu ay ang kadtong gisulat ni Dr. Resil as a forward sa libro kabahin sa nobela, kabahin sa kinabuhi ni Lapu-Lapu. Sa ako silang giingon, basaha usa na ninyo aron kamo maka-ideya og unsaon ninyo pag-approach ang inyong pelikula nga himuon. Ambot og ninduol ba sila kang Dr. Resil, pero muna akong rekomendasyon tungod kay dili man ako ang eksperto. So congratulations Resil in advance for this lecture. Anugon nga ulahin na nako ng hibawan nga aduna kadi ay lecture kay interesado gyud ko mamati nimo. Dali ka kaayo sayon ka kaayang basahon and yung latest nga na nabasa nako ang kabahin kang Lapu-Lapu o kabahin din sa World War II nga libro impod nga gihimo. And as I said, dili man kinahanglan nga pareho ang atong ideya, di man kinahanglan nga pareho ang atong interpretasyon kasi sa karong panahon daghan man nga mga issue nga wala pa gyud ma-settle, pero ang importante nga garespeto kita sa usa o usa. So unta nag-attend din ang atong mga teachers nga nagatudlo og history sa atong mga eskwelahan. Dili lamang ang mga Bisaya, dili lamang ang mga taga Negros, kundi tanan nga Pilipino. Kay ang nahitabo sa Cebu, sa Negros, sa uban nga lugar ay konektado man pod sa kinatibuk-an nga revolusyon sa atong pagsukol, sa atong pagdaog sa Espanya. So congratulations again, and interesado ako tungod kay ako taga Negros Oriental man ko sa Dumaguete, and kebalo man ko nga sayon lang kaya magtabok-tabok ang taga Dumaguete mo ato Cebu, ang taga Cebu mo ato sa Dumaguete, mao nga adunay connection, adunay relasyon ang Cebu ug ang Dumaguete going all the way back to the times of the revolution. So I'm very interested unta makadawat ko og kopya sa lecture nimo Dr. Resil, and I hope ang imong lecture maka-provoke o maka-elicit og lain-lain nga mga opinyon o maka-stir up og debate ug unsa wag gyud nahitabo sa revolusyon nato kontra sa mga Kastila o sa Pilipino, ilabi na sa Cebu. So congratulations sa inyong tanan. I look forward to receiving a copy of your lecture. I enjoy reading what you write about. And as I said, we don't have to agree all the time, but to respect each other all the time. Congratulations again to the Ramon Aboitiz Foundation. And I'm very happy that DepEd officials and teachers are also attending this webinar aron dili nila limtan ang ilang kabilin, dili lamang para sa Cebu o sa Negros kundi sa buong tibukan nato nga nasod sa Pilipinas. Daghang salamat and have a good seminar. Thank you.
To give a message in behalf of Rafi and to introduce our esteemed speaker this afternoon is the president of the Ramon Aboitiz Foundation Incorporated, Ms. Amaya Aboitiz Fansler.
Tanan. On behalf of the Ramon Aboitiz Foundation, I would like to welcome everyone to the Gabii sa Kabilin online activity, a series of webinars that will allow us to explore and connect more deeply with our theme for the year, which is the arrival of the Magellanic expedition in the Philippines and the interaction and impact this has had on our culture. At RAFI, we believe that a strong understanding of one's culture and identity is integral to the health and well-being of our community. And it's also integral to the development of engaged and informed citizens. Through our Culture and Heritage Unit, we bring to you events and activities that bring us together to connect with different aspects of our Cebuano culture and develop an understanding and appreciation of the events and circumstances that have shaped who we are and where we live today. We believe that engaging with you in meaningful dialogue about issues that have shaped who we are will also help us make good choices for the future. I once took a class called Facing History and Ourselves that put it quite simply. People make choices, and choices make history. For this reason, we are especially excited to welcome our teachers from the Department of Education. We look forward to partnering with you as you shape the citizens that will make informed choices for our community and write our country's history. A strong appreciation of our common heritage also plays a special role during these times that do not allow us to meet face to face. Studies have shown that a strong sense of identity and activities that connect us to a common heritage become especially important, increasing positive emotions and enabling positive social connections with others. We hope that today's lecture and the subsequent activities we have planned will be a valuable resource as you continue your very important work with our students. Today's webinar will explore the Philippine-Spanish Revolution in Cebu, and we are led by no other than a Cebuano national artist, Dr. Resil Mojares. National artist Resil B. Mojares is Professor Emeritus at the University of San Carlos in Cebu City, where he was the founding director of the Cebuano Studies Center from 1975 to the year 2000. He served as visiting professor in universities in the United States, Japan, Singapore, and the Philippines, and has authored, co-authored, and edited more than 25 books, and published numerous articles in books and journals in the Philippines and abroad. Among his books are Origins and the Rise of the Philippine Novel, published in 1983, House of Memory, published in 1997, Waiting for Mariang Makiling, published in 2002, Brains of a Nation, 2006, Isabella's Archive, 2013, and Interrogations in Philippine Cultural History, published in 2017. For his writings and scholarship on the diverse aspects of the Philippine culture and history, he has been awarded national and international honors. In 2018, he was conferred the title of National Artist in Literature. For this webinar, we know of no other expert alive to lecture on the Spanish-Philippine Revolution in Cebu, and are grateful that he accepted our request to join us. Once again, we thank you for joining us. We hope that you enjoy this journey back through time, and we hope to see you again for our other Gabii sa Kabilin events this year.
Good afternoon, mayong hapon. I'm glad to be with you, although I still find it weird to be talking to people I don't see. But kind of, I find it a special treat seeing Secretary Liling Briones, even if only on screen, because Liling and I go back half a century. Although we see each other very, very rarely. When I was invited to give a talk on the subject of the Philippine Revolution, I was somewhat perplexed as to why this particular topic, until Heidi reminded me it's Independence Day. So if belatedly, that's the event that we are marking this afternoon, using as occasion the annual Kabilin of the museums in Cebu. When I was asked as to what the title of my talk would be, I said the title is Unanswered Questions about the Revolution in Cebu. Because I think the problem with commemorative events is that often these events get repetitive. You tell the same story over and over again. And given the celebratory character of commemorations, often they're meant to be very general and kind of inspirational in character. That's why it's glad you have occasions like this, as Secretary Briones said, that you need to put in a bit of the scholarly and academic into the discourse on the topic being marked. So I was thinking of particular topics about the revolution that are not as yet clearly or adequately answered. So the nature of the talk is that I don't have a formal paper, because my impression of having a seminar is you don't really give a formal lecture. But I would like to speak about particular aspects of the revolution that I think we need to inquire more deeply about, because in many ways these are aspects that are not adequately documented or explained. So my interest is strongly research-oriented, and so I'm thinking of certain questions that are not quite fully answered. To begin with, when we speak of the Philippine Revolution and when the revolution started, of course, the standard answer in national history is that the revolution began with a Bonifacio-led insurrection in Manila in the month of August 1896. So 1896 is the year that marked the beginning of the revolution. But of course, history does not proceed at the same pace. And so, in the case of much of the rest of the country outside the Tagalog region, the revolution actually started much later. In the case of Cebu, we mark 3 de Abril, the 3rd of April, 1898. That means a year and something like 8 months after the Tagalog insurrection. That it was only in 1898 that the revolution started. And I think one under-researched topic in the story of the revolution in Cebu is we know very little of what happened prior to the outbreak of the revolution in April 1896. When the Tagalog insurrection started in August 1896, the question of what was going on in Cebu in August 1896? When did the Cebuanos learn about the outbreak of the revolution? And what was the Cebuano response to the start of the revolution in Manila and environs, and then spread later to neighboring Tagalog provinces? Well, the answer to the question is that, to begin with, we know very little, but what we know is that practically nothing happened in Cebu. I think Cebu learned about the outbreak of the hostilities in Manila probably a day or two after the start of the events. But there was nothing, no disturbance at all took place in Cebu. I mean, there were some anxieties on the part of local officials, like for instance, the Guardia Civil was put on alert. Foot patrols were increased, and public discussion of what was going on in Manila were prohibited. Like rumor mongering was prohibited and punished, and authorities were directed to conduct surveillance of suspicious characters in Cebu, specifically strangers and particularly Tagalogs, who were, of course, were under suspicion because of the events taking place in the Tagalog provinces. But outside of this, no disturbance, as far as we know, took place in Cebu, and everything was quiet. In fact, the most in a sense, important event that took place at this time was the organizing of the voluntarios leales, meaning the loyal volunteers, the loyal volunteers for the government, because the local community, mostly led by Spanish residents in Cebu and government officials, started organizing a force of volunteers that would be sent to Manila, to Luzon, in order to help suppress the uprising. And so there was a fundraising drive in order to buy horses for the volunteer force that will go to Manila to purchase or produce uniforms and so on. And it's interesting if you read the report that they were buying hats and ribbons and had a portrait of the Spanish king painted for the banners and so on. They organized a volunteer force and sent them off in style to Manila in order to help the Spanish government suppressed the Tagalog rebels. And actually, a 400-man, a rather large force of 400 men was sent to Luzon and stayed there for 6 months. But saw no action, probably beyond doing guard duty. They really were not involved in the fighting. Also because it was a time when the hostilities were beginning to die down. So, and what is also interesting to note is that those who were active in the raising of a force of loyal volunteers were the most prominent families in Cebu. And for instance, if you read the report about who were the contributors to raising such a volunteer force, you find names like Osmeña, Veloso, Singson, Velez, Ralios, Borromeo, Duterte, and so on. So these were the leading families in Cebu that were active in sending a volunteer force to help the authorities suppress the Tagalog insurrection. So outside of that, nothing much happened in Cebu in 1896. And so the revolution in Cebu itself did not begin until more than a year and a half later. The other aspect also is that although we know that the uprising in Cebu started on April 3, 1898, we actually know very little about what happened or what was going on prior to April 3, 1898. Meaning what was happening, that like the organizing, recruitment, and exactly when was a local chapter of Akatipunan, if there was such a formal chapter formed. So we don't really know much about what preceded the outbreak of the revolution. So we know that 3 de Abril, the uprising in Cebu started, but we don't know enough. We don't have a clear picture of exactly what was going on prior to April 3, 1898. So anybody who's interested in doing research on the revolution will have a lot of fresh ground to cover, because there are still a lot of gaps in our knowledge of the revolution that took place in Cebu. For instance, one rather mysterious event that took place prior to April 3, 1898 was the so-called Kamba Street Massacre. Kamba Street is a street in Binondo, in the Manila Port area, where on March 25, 1898, that means a little over a week before the start of the uprising here in Cebu, there was a massacre of a large number of men who are referred to as like Visayan seamen. Visayan seamen. That the massacre started when it was reported that there was a large group of men who were gathered in a house on Kamba Street in Binondo. In some estimates say that there were like 70 to 100 men gathered in the house. And a passersby became suspicious and reported this gathering to the authorities, and the Guardia Civil raided the house and killed, by some accounts, something like 50 men, and arrested kind of a large number of the Visayan seamen who were supposedly gathered in that place. And what we learn is that, in fact, what is said to be the real story here was that this was a meeting place of men who were actually planning an uprising in Manila to seize control Manila, and which was kind of a conspiracy based in the port area. And according to one version led by a man named Feliciano Huxon, a Tagalog, who was one of the early members of the Katipunan. You must remember that March, you must remember that that we are already in that time. This was the time actually when there was a cessation, formal cessation of hostilities because of the Pact of Biak na Bato. And in a sense, the Bonifacio had already died when he was executed in May 1897. And then with the Pact of Biak na Bato in 1897, there was a formal cessation of hostilities. But what we learn is that actually, even after the Pact of Biak na Bato and the exile of the entire leadership of the revolution to Hong Kong, there was still a great deal of organizing taking place in Manila, and particularly in Manila and the Tagalog provinces, organized by apparently elements who were not quite reconciled to the Pact of Biak na Bato. And these men were mostly what they call Bonifacistas, meaning the followers of Bonifacio, because the Bonifacios party, as it were, the Katipunan, had practically disbanded after the execution of Andres Bonifacio. So from May 1897, in a sense, the Katipunan had ceased to exist because Bonifacio had died, and now the revolution was led by Aguinaldo and mostly the leaders who had their base in Cavite. So the interesting part of the story is that in fact there was still a great deal of organizing going on, even when formally the revolution had already ended. That's why, like when we speak of the Philippine Revolution, we often refer to the first phase and the second phase. The first phase starts with Bonifacio, and then the takeover of the leadership by Aguinaldo, and then ended with the Pact of Biak na Bato in December 1897. And the second phase started only after the Americans came because of the Spanish-American War, which came around May 1898, when, in a sense, the hostilities and the revolution resumed. No? So, an interesting thing about the revolution in Cebu was that the instigators of the revolution and the early personalities involved in it were what some writers would call Bonifacistas. They were like followers of Bonifacio rather than Aguinaldo. Although, from the standpoint of Cebuanos, they probably were not too concerned about these factions, no. So they had started to organize for resuming the revolution, and whether they were completely aware of the division between the forces of Bonifacio and those of Aguinaldo, we don't really, probably we're not that concerned about it. But it's still interesting to point out that the first personalities that appear prior to April 1898 were Tagalogs connected with the old Bonifacio faction. That's why, like, you have two mysterious characters in Cebu who are often credited with having, in a sense, initiated organizing of the Katipunan in Cebu. And these men are Gil Domingo and Hermogenes Plata, who were both Bonifacistas, meaning followers of Bonifacio. And even Feliciano Hopson, the ones who was supposedly the leader of the conspiracy that ended with the Kamba Street massacre, was also a Bonifacista. So this is the Tagalog connection that the first Cebuano revolutionaries had. Hermogenes Plata, we know something about him. Hermogenes Plata was the brother of Teodoro Plata. Teodoro Plata was probably one of the three founders of the Katipunan, together with Bonifacio. Teodoro Plata and Andres Bonifacio were related because I think they married, if my memory is correct, they married sisters. You know, Gregoria de Jesus, the wife of Andres Bonifacio, was the sister of the wife of Teodoro Plata. So Teodoro Plata was an important figure, although he's kind of people, a lot of people, most people don't remember him anymore, was because he was executed by the Spaniards very early. So Hermogenes Plata was the brother of Teodoro Plata. And apparently he was one of those who were very active in reviving the revolution after Aguinaldo and the other leaders had left for Hong Kong. So most local accounts, in fact, mention Hermogenes Plata and Hail Domingo. Although about Hail Domingo, we know practically nothing. So the name may not have been his real name, but we don't know anything about Hail Domingo. But Hail Domingo and Hermogenes Plata are usually mentioned as those who started organizing the Katipunan, not themselves, but through they had kind of agents and recruiters who came to Cebu in order to help organize the revolution in Cebu. So the reason why the mention of Visayan seamen in Kamba Street is interesting is because the start of the organizing of the Katipunan in Cebu was also such that a person named Anastasio Oclarino, who was Tagalog, he was from Laguna, was a machinista of the ship that plied the route from Manila to the Visayas, Cebu. So he was like a ship engineer of a boat named Bohol, which kind of traveled between Manila and Cebu. An agent of the Katipunan. And so he's the local accounts. The local accounts mention practically all the local accounts mention his name, that he was the one who, in a sense, was the link between the Katipunan in Manila and the Katipunan in Cebu, this fellow Anastasio Oclarino. And in fact, we also learned that Anastasio Oclarino was also the agent who started organizing the revolution in Butuan and in Surigao, because the steamboat Bohol, named Bohol, which was owned by Smithville, stopped at these ports. So this is an aspect that I think is interesting because it has not really been looked at very closely. In fact, I asked at one time, I said, did the Katipunan also have, their own form of a navy? Because obviously, seamen were important in an archipelago like the Philippines for spreading the revolution. I mean, how do you spread the revolution if you don't have people who kind of can travel to the other islands? That's why, like, ship engineers or maquinistas of boats, crewmen played an important role in spreading the revolution particularly in the southern Philippines, in Visayas and Mindanao. So this was kind of the role that Anastasio Oclarino had in helping initiate the revolution in Cebu. And his first contacts in Cebu were people who were working in the pier. Like prominent here are workers in Smithville. Smithville, the large trading firm that is British owned and had its large building right beside City Hall, and so, like for instance, you had also a Tagalog named Mariano Hernandez, who was the abaca press operator of Smithville. Because there were abaca was a major item of trade in the 19th century. So it's interesting that we know of at least 3 workers in Smithville who were among the first members of the Katipunan in Cebu. From seamen to dock workers, and then later to influential local residents in Cebu. So this was what was going on in the months before April 3. Although this is really one topic that would be interesting for additional research to be done, because it's not clear as to what facts can still be necessarily retrieved about this particular period, because all we know is that the organizing started probably late 1897. So we don't really have like some specific date as to when, say, the Katipunan was organized in Cebu. And we're not even sure whether it was really kind of formally constituted as a chapter of the Katipunan, or it was just kind of a local group of revolutionaries. So in the sense of the agents of the revolution, I think seamen, sailors played an important role. But I think what is characteristic about the spread of the revolution, because how the revolution spread throughout the Philippines is something that has not been really fully studied. But we assume that important persons here are kind of people who move, when people who travel, like salesmen or soldiers, meaning native soldiers, salesmen, like in the case of Leon Quilat or Pantaleon Villegas, he was supposed to be at one time working as a circus performers, a traveling circus, because people who move like salesmen, sailors, soldiers who get posted to various places in the country, and these are the types who kind of are natural agents for spreading revolutionary ideas. That's why, like, among the earliest personalities we have Anastasio Oclarino, another worker of Smithville, who is also said to have worked as an agent of Singer and Company. Singer and Company, the famous manufacturer of sewing machines. Gabino Gabukayan, Pantaleon Villegas, Leon Quilat. These were the earliest personalities and people who, in a sense, were moving from place to place. So the Smithville connection also is important. And then finally, of course, the main force of the revolution, or in terms of the Cebuano revolutionaries, were of course what you would call locals, meaning people who actually lived here. But again, it's interesting that the important personalities are really migrants from other places. They were already residents of Cebu, but they were actually people who came here from other places. One that we can mention two examples. The two most important uh, personalities of the revolution outside of Leon Kilat were one, Luis Flores, and second, Florencio Gonzales. Luis Flores was from Samar, although by the 1880s, he was already a resident of Cebu. He was married and had set up residence in Cebu, but he was born in Samar. Luis Flores was the head of the revolutionary government in Cebu, and he became later the first governor of Cebu, the first governor of the province of Cebu, Luis Flores. The sad thing is we know very little about him. In fact, I remember a conversation with Agnes Magpali a few years ago, and she was asking me, what exactly do we know about the first governor of Cebu? You know, he's recognized by the provincial government as the first governor of Cebu, the first Filipino governor of Cebu. And the thing is, we actually know very little about him. There's a source which says he was born in Calbayog. And if that is true, then it would be worthwhile for somebody who's really interested in the subject to do research in Calbayog to find out as to whether you will come across still descendants of Luis Flores in Samar. And I think it's possible if Calbayog is correct, for you to be able to kind of collect fresh data on Luis Flores. Otherwise, we have a first governor of Cebu about whom we know very little. The other personality who's very interesting is Florencio Gonzales, who was from Surigao. But he was, at the time of the revolution, an official in the court of first instance in Cebu. He was a notary and kind of an interesting man because he came from also a very interesting family in Surigao who played a very important role also in the revolution in Surigao. And I think the reason why Florencio Gonzales is not, in fact, if the reason why he's not as widely known as he should be is because he was executed by the Spaniards a few days after April 3. He was arrested on April 2, and I think he was executed April 7. And his brother, Fortunato Gonzales, who was also involved in the revolutionary conspiracy, was also executed. So, but the Gonzaleses were primarily based, as a family, they were primarily based in Surigao. And in fact, his brothers, I think Juan and Wenceslao, were governors of Surigao and Agusan during the revolutionary period. So they were a kind of a very colorful family in Surigao. In fact, when I learned that Wenceslao Gonzales, who was a revolutionary governor of Agusan, worked as an official of the Bureau of Customs in Manila for some years. I mean, that's a further connection because if he was with the Bureau of Customs, that means he was very closely connected with sailors in the port area. That's why that as kind of a link to the revolution in Cebu is interesting. But then finally, of course, the main force of the revolution were local municipal officials, uh, students, professionals, and so on. But still, a lot of aspects of the revolution that we need to do research on. One, of course, that interests me, but has not really been well studied, is the role of the role of the agrarian problem in the Talisay Minglanilla Augustinian estate in the revolution, because San Nicolas and Talisay were major sites of the revolutionary conspiracy. And I think there is a link to the agrarian problem in the Augustinian estate to the revolution. In any case, I'd like to end by strongly recommending probably the most informative book that we have on the revolution in Cebu is Michael Collinane's Arenas of Conspiracy, which was published by Ateneo de Manila in 2014. I would even hazard to say that this is probably the most important book on the revolution in Cebu that has been published since the revolution itself. And it's rich with information on the personalities involved in the revolution. And so if you would like to find out as to who was involved in the revolution in Cebu and who were they, this is a book that you should consult. But let me end right there so we can move on to your questions.
Daghang salamat, Sir Resil, for pointing out areas where we can do further research for about the anti-Spanish revolution. And I'm pretty sure there are many who are interested, who are part of our participants here in the Gabii sa Kabilin webinar this afternoon. And so we will go right away to our Q&A, sir. What we will do is that we're going to be flashing some of the questions that we have our participants actually commented on in their in the comment section of the GSK FB site. No? So here's the first question, sir. Which national order did the Cebuano revolutionaries follow, Bonifacio or Aguinaldo? Maybe towards the end, sir, no?
Yeah. I mentioned that it's in bounce not. Anyway, I mentioned that it's interesting that the links of the first revolutionaries in Cebu, the links with Manila, were links with personalities that you may call Bonifacistas. These were kind of revolutionaries who were or had been allied with Bonifacio. But remember that Bonifacio was executed May 1897, right? That means after the execution of Bonifacio, in a sense, the Bonifacio party or faction had kind of, in a sense, collapsed. And now the initiative passed on to Aguinaldo. So, but the kind of, in a sense, the old followers of Bonifacio became active again after the Pact of Biak na Bato, because kind of, in a sense, the revolution was, in fact, a lot of Bonifacio's followers decided to follow Aguinaldo, because kind of when Aguinaldo, in a sense, took over the leadership of the revolution, many also kind of followed Aguinaldo. But then that revolution ended the Pact of Biak na Bato. So Aguinaldo did not return until May 1898 with the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, so that, and resumed the second phase of the revolution, as it were. So you have a period from December 1897, the Pact of Biak-na-Bato, to May 1898, the return of Aguinaldo, when there was, in a sense, kind of a vacuum of leadership. But as I said, there were elements who were again active organizing, even though kind of the war, the revolution was, as it were, formally over because of the peace pact of Biak-na-Bato. So this was also when the revolutionary organizing started in Cebu. So it kind of is logical that their links would be with the Bonifacistas, because kind of Aguinaldo had already left for Hong Kong. As to how aware the Cebuanos were to this kind of internal politics, we don't know. Perhaps they were not, this was not really that important to them. And so to speak of the Cebuano revolutionaries as Bonifacistas may not be quite accurate, isn't that right? So, because the internal politics in Manila may have, not been that important for Cebu. In any case, with respect to your question as to whether they follow the orders of Aguinaldo, Cebuano, particularly, this became particularly apparent with already in the anti-American phase, the war against the Americans, isn't that right? Because what happened was that the April 3, the revolution or uprising in Cebu started. By April 7, the Cebuano revolutionaries were in retreat, is that right? Because reinforcements came, there was a bombardment of Cebu by the Spanish cruiser that had come, I think, from Iloilo, because reinforcements came from Iligan and Iloilo. And so the revolutionaries withdrew from the city. Leon Quilat and his men went to Karkar, where Leon Quilat was assassinated, and the other leaders went to Sudlon, where they started to regroup. But that means April 3, May 1, there was a Battle of Manila Bay when Admiral George Dewey, so that's a short span of time. Meaning to say, by May 1898, the complexion of the war had changed, because now you have the Americans had already demolished the Spanish fleet in Manila, and not long after, Manila was surrendered by the Spaniards to the Americans. So now we shift to a different war. This is the war against the Americans. It is clear from the primary documents available, like captured documents of the Cebuano revolutionaries, and we have more documentation for the anti-American resistance as against the Spanish period. We don't have the documentation is not as large as in the American phase of the war. In the American phase of the war, clearly the Cebuanos acknowledged Aguinaldo as the head and received the orders and obeyed orders that came from the Aguinaldo government. That's the answer to the question.
Thank you for that, sir. And we have to thank also Pauline, what's the name of the one who gave the question, Pauline Abelia Nosa, for the question. This would mean, sir, that the anti-Spanish revolution was actually short here in Cebu. Yeah. Anyway, we have sir.
The kind of the anti-Spanish revolution was short, and in fact, in terms of destruction, loss of lives and property, the destruction was much larger in the American, uh, the war against the Americans. I mean, the scale of destruction and the loss of lives, I mean, these were much larger in the war against the Americans than in the anti-Spanish Revolution, in the case of Cebu.
Thank you for clarifying that, sir. Before we proceed to our second question, we'd like to acknowledge our many participants in your GSK webinar here, sir. We have about 700 participants this afternoon, and that's an all-time high actually for us also. We'd like to acknowledge the teachers from DepEd, of course. They're the force behind actually our GSK webinar this afternoon, sir. We have DepEd Bohol, Ginhulnga, Negros, Bai City, Dumaguete City, Negros Oriental, Carcar City, Danao City, Naga City, of course Cebu City, Mandaue City, and Lapu-Lapu City. They all came to hear you, sir, this afternoon. We also have people from UP Diliman in Quezon City, and even as far as Mindanao from Surigao City. Thank you very much for being a part of our GSK webinar this afternoon. Let's move on to our next question. Good day. How did the early revolutionaries rely on updates from what happened in Manila in the period that followed the revolution? And how did the elite people in Cebu react to the violence that happened in Manila? This is from Vince Derek Joaquino. Sir, you can just opt to answer the first question and then you can go to the next after.
I have a kind of a very poor memory for numbers. But by the time of the revolution, sea travel between Manila and Cebu had been kind of drastically cut down. So I think it was just kind of something like sea travel from something like 2 days or less, meaning, so in a sense, communication was much faster at the end of the 19th century than in say 18th or early 19th, meaning news news about what was going in Manila came relatively quickly, and also there was a telegraph service already, but of course that was not something that was popularly available. So communications had kind of vastly improved by the late 19th century. And that's why I stress the important role of seamen, because they were in a sense the ones who carried messages between Cebu and Manila. That's why they like, for instance, I started to find out as to how the revolution started in the provinces, in Catanduanes, in Sorsogon, in Agusan, in Surigao, and I imagine in a lot of other places, sailors and crewmen, people working on board ships, are important in in not just spreading the news, but as kind of agitators and recruiters and so on. That's why, as I said, somebody should do a study of how the revolution spread outside, in a sense, the Tagalog provinces. And in the south, of course, kind of sea travel was so I would not even be surprised if they actually made an attempt at organizing sailors as agents of the revolution, because they were essential for spreading the revolution in the provinces. Your second question, although what was that again?
Let's flash the second question again. How did the elite people in Cebu react to the violence that happened in Manila?
I mentioned 1896 as to what the reaction of Cebu was to the beginning of the Tagalog insurrection in 1896. No, I mean the first phase of the revolution, and how Cebuanos organized a volunteer force to help the Spanish authorities suppress the insurrection, and actually sent a 400-man volunteer force, no, complete with their uniforms and badges and ribbons with kind of the Spanish national colors. They were like going off in style to help the government fight the Tagalog rebels. So the elite stayed completely loyal to Spain. In fact, one article that has survived uh, about one item about Sergio Osmeña, no? Sergio Osmeña, the late President Sergio Osmeña, not Sergio Osmeña Jr., but Sergio Osmeña was at that time in 1896. It's either he had just finished his college education in UST, Santo Tomas, or he was on his last year. He may have been on his last year and had to come back to Cebu because of the suspension of classes, because of the start of the hostilities in. And so we have a letter written by him, published in El Comercio, which is a major newspaper in Manila, where he attacks, he condemns the Tagalog rebels for their ingratitude, and wrote what did he say? I mean, his exact words were something like eliminate the bastards, referring to the Tagalog rebels. So that, you know, in a sense, that was characteristic of what the elite response was to the revolution that had started in Manila. Although kind of Sergio Osmeña probably voiced his sentiments in a much stronger fashion, because Sergio Osmeña was at the beginning of his career as he was a protege of the Spanish governor. He was like kind of what you would call today a press relations officer or personal aide of the Spanish governors. He was already a young man on the rise, Sergio Osmeña. So in fact, he was awarded a kind of medal of merit as for his contributions to the Spanish government. So that's why, like, according to the story, although this may be apocryphal, but this became a subject in politics, in political campaigns, in anti-Osmeña campaigns in the pre-war period, that when the Tres de Abril uprising took place in Cebu, Sergio Osmeña fled the city dressed as a woman in order to escape being identified, because he was already known to be, you know, he was, after all, the personal aide of the Spanish governor. So the story is that he dressed himself as a woman in order to escape from the city, which at the time was already effectively controlled by the insurrectos. And this was preserved, I think, all throughout the Spanish period. If you look at the old pre-war newspapers and magazines, the favorite caricature of Osmeña in editorial cartoons was of Osmeña in barot saya, no? Kind of, you know, woman's dress, because this alludes to that story of his escaping Cebu dressed as a woman. So that may be apocryphal, but the point is that Osmeña had already a reputation as a Spanish loyalist at the time of Tres de Abril.
Sir, maybe just a follow-up. Were there prominent people who were part of the Cebuano Revolution, anti-Spanish, on the anti-Spanish side?
The elite.
Were they
The elite.
the elite?
The elite of the city was by and large loyal to Spain. In fact, the important split, and this is explained very well in Mike Collinane's book, is that one reason why the principales of San Nicolas, meaning the elite, I mean, the problem with the word elite is that it's relative, you know. Kind of, if you are elite in Balamban, you are not elite in Cebu City. Meaning, Cebu City is where you have, you know, kind of in a sense, the wealthiest, most influential families, right? Yeah, Veloso, Osmania, and so on. But you have municipal elites. So the municipal elite of San Nicolas, you know, like Abelia, Abellana, were kind of far below the level of the city elite, is that right? And there was enmity between San Nicolas, the town of San Nicolas, and Cebu City, because in 1890, just a few years before the outbreak of the revolution, San Nicolas was abolished as a town and integrated into the city when the Ayuntamiento was re-established in 1890. Meaning, and this was a cause of grievance on the part of the leaders of San Nicolas, because now they had lost their status as an independent town and had become just a district of the city. And so this was an important reason why there was kind of animosity between the elite of the city and the elite, kind of the municipal elite. And I think in Cebu, and this appears to be true in Luzon as well. It appears to be true in Luzon as well. Because there's kind of a book by Milagros Guerrero, actually her dissertation, which was never published. But it's a major work where, like, also she comes to the conclusion that the group that played a vital role in organizing and maintaining or leading the revolution were municipal elites, no? Meaning these were like kind of the elites of the towns, and that's the case with Cebu as well, no? So if you look at the kind of this book by Mike Cullinane, this is interesting because what Mike Cullinane did, and you should encourage you to get hold of a copy of the book. This is published by Ateneo de Manila. Michael Cullinane, who did work in Cebu for many years, meticulously identified who the leaders and participants of the revolution were in the first months of the revolution, the first months of the 1898 uprising in Cebu. And he was able to identify 326 names. And of the 326, he was able to able to identify 340 leaders and participants, and was able to get for 326 of them data on things like education, occupation, residence, even linkages as relatives or as neighbors. Really a very detailed analysis of who these people were. No? So he was able to get data for 326 men. No? And from the data he collected, 88% of these men were salaried employees or municipal office holders or principales. So these were like the important groups: municipal officers, as well as employees, mostly clerks. No? And the thing with clerks is that clerks today, we tend to say that they are kind of, in a sense, low-level, right? But in the 19th century, if you're a clerk, I mean, that's really something, because that means you're literate, in a society, or what was the percentage of people you had some education, meaning you are relative to the times well educated, no? Escribiente, that. So, so 88% were people of this type or municipal office holders, like, mayors, or even like kind of barangay captain, or councilors and so on. 88% of them, and 70% of the 326 had some secondary or tertiary education. I mean, that's remarkable. Meaning you have, I mean, this was not a revolt of the masses. This is a revolt of kind of the problem is we don't, our vocabulary for social groups or classes in the 19th century, the vocabulary is kind of not quite precise, right? So, but most writers of that period would refer, even the Spaniards themselves would refer to them as medio ilustrados, meaning kind of almost like middle, what you call middle class or middle class. Definitely not lower class. No, I mean, if you have a high school education in the 19th century, you're highly educated, right? I mean, it's like having like your kind of secondary, senior high school graduate. Today we're again kind of going back to the idea that senior high school is not kind of can already like start to work, kind of, and so that, and this is also the case in Manila, because the fortunate thing is that there was another scholar, Jim Richardson, I think he's an Englishman, did exactly the same type of study that Mike did for Cebu. And I think Jim Richardson published his in 2013. Mike published his in 2014. And they were like working independently with each other, but they were studying the same problem using the same methodology. And what Jim Richardson, for the case of Manila, did, he was dealing with who were the members of the Katipunan before the outbreak of the revolution, because the Katipunans was founded 1892. So there was still like a few years of organizing before they actually like rose up in arms. So Jim Richardson, based on archival records in Spain, identified who the Katipunan members were between the founding in 1892 to the outbreak of the revolution in 1896. And he got 145 names, the names of 145 names for that period. Of the 145, 59 are past or present government officials. So either mayors or barangay captains or government employees and so on. Mostly, the employees are mostly in clerical positions like escribano or what you call escribiente. So, kind of distinctly what you call petit bourgeois, petit bourgeoisie, meaning like kind of middle class. And then 45 are mostly skilled workers and artisans, meaning people with kind of skilled workers like blacksmiths, jewelers, and so on. So it's like the general conclusion of Michael Cullinane and Jim Richardson kind of coincide, except that the difference is that in Manila, there was a greater number of urban artisans, meaning like factory workers and so on, which is easily to be explained by the fact that such occupational groups were practically non-existent or very small in Cebu, whereas Manila is kind of far more industrialized. So they had factory workers, printing press employees, and and so on. That's why, like, the problem with kind of conceiving the revolution as the revolt of the masses, in fact, it is inaccurate, because if you think about who actually carried out or initiated the revolution, they were like kind of, I think you can call it middle class. I mean, that probably would be the most approximate description. And one reason also why current present day readers don't appreciate that is that I think for one, we don't know too much about kind of the categories of occupational groups. Like, for instance, we tend to think of it in present day terms. Like when you say clerk, that's a kind of low class. No? When clerk, in fact, was quite high in the 19th century. And even certain occupational groups. I gave a lecture on Andres Bonifacio's class position. And I said, Andres Bonifacio was the son of the vice mayor of Tondo. But he was not kind of, non-entity. His father was teniente, kind of roughly the equivalent of the vice mayor of Tondo. And his father was supposed to be what do you call it, banquero, a boatman. But the thing is, boatman may mean that you own the boat, is that right? And he may have owned who knows? He was, after all, vice mayor. He may have known 2 or 3, because river transportation in Manila, those river boats are the equivalent of today's taxi, meaning like his father owned probably 2 or 3 taxis, which is because even like we say, Bonifacio was just a bodeguero, which he was at one time. But he was a bodeguero in a foreign kind of a foreign firm, and bodeguero is rather vague. He may have been a warehouse. He was in charge of the warehouse, not necessarily a common laborer. Is that right? So, and so that the scale of occupational groups is different in the 19th century compared to today. That's why, like, I gave a talk on this subject in Makati, and when I mentioned that Andres Bonifacio worked as an agent and at one time of a foreign trading firm, a German foreign trading firm, I said he may have been from Tondo, but he already had an entry job in Makati. And besides Tondo also, it's a kind of, it says, a misconception to think of Tondo according to its reputation today. In the 19th century, Tondo was perhaps one of the most economically dynamic districts in Manila because it was in the port area. That's why it had a large concentration of urban artisans, kind of artists, carpenters, masons, jewelers, blacksmiths, kind of. So Tondo was a very kind of dynamic, both in demographic as well as economic terms, in the 19th century. But today, our image of Tondo is different. So you have to kind of situate it in those times to see kind of what the status of the persons involved is.
Thank you for that, sir. Maybe we'll give sir a few seconds to take his water or something. Sir has been answering your questions, no, but you have the answers are very packed, and we get to learn a lot in a sense of the revolution, even at the context and the backgrounds. So I know we have a lot of questions, but we'll try to accommodate as much as we can. So maybe we can go to the third question this time. Question 3 from Vanette Colmenares. Good afternoon, listening from New York. Interesting topic. Unless you are in Ilustrado, Indios were not so educated during the revolution. Therefore, there were so many conspiracy theories, but I am sure there are literary evidences that have emerged. Where to find them? How reliable are the oral stories that people make of which all these revolution, and where can you suggest that we start?
I assume you're interested in the subject of conspiracy theories in the 19th century. That's really interesting. I only had kind of one occasion to write an article that's somewhat related to that subject, and on the subject of rumors. The subject of rumors. And the thing is, it's difficult to do a history of rumors in terms of because rumors are and conspiracy theories would be like one form of rumor, etc., right? Because before the internet, how did conspiracy theories spread? So rumor, of course, was important. So, this is a story that kind of intrigued me. Actually, this is much earlier, probably like 1870s. The story of Father Manuel Blanco, the Augustinian. The story was told that Father Manuel Blanco, who was renowned as a scholar, he was a botanist. He authored Flora de Filipinas, isn't that right? He was an Augustinian. That the story is told that Father Manuel Blanco was ordered by his superiors to write, like, why write about plants? You should write about something that is more important. And they wanted him to write a treatise on the character of the Indio, on the character of the Indio. And obedient to his vows, Father Manuel Blanco, a botanist, said that he was going to write this treatise on the character of the native, the character of the Indio. And so he withdrew to the Augustinian convent in Guadalupe near Makati now. There was the site of an Augustinian convent at the time. And devoted himself for a number of years working on this treatise. He left behind, said to his colleagues, he said that he did not want to be disturbed and does not want anyone to look at what he was writing until kind of it's finished and so on. Anyway, Father Manuel Blanco died, and so his fellow friars kind of went to his cell, his room, to find the book that he had been working on so diligently. And they saw a big volume entitled, with the title inscribed, Il Indio. And when they opened the pages, they were shocked to see that these were all blank pages. So this was a story that was circulated. It became very popular at the time. One point of the story is that the Indio is an emptiness. He's vacant. He's a tabula rasa. There's kind of zero. So that's why, like, there's nothing that can be said about him, and that's why you have a book of empty pages. So although kind of other interpretations have been given. But anyway, I was so curious about the story. I wanted to find out when did these stories circulate and who, and so so it's difficult to do a history of a humor. So I was able to find 3 or 4 books which allude to this particular story. Like one of the earliest was something like 1870, and there's a reference to this story. And it's referred to in a way that suggests that this was already well known at the time. But the subject of rumors, or what we call today conspiracy theories, is something that's kind of interesting. You should do something along this line. Like the story, for instance, of Bernardo Carpio, mentioned by Rizal, who was going to return and liberate his people. So this was another story that was circulating at the time, which there are many versions. Like even here in Cebu, this was already during the war against the Americans. The story is told that Rizal was returning and was there was a vessel that had docked on the west coast. The story was told that Rizal had returned and was in Cebu. So these were kind of rumors that which are important for giving us a sense of what the intellectual and emotional climate was in those times. Somebody should do work on that topic.
Thank you for that, sir. Let's go to the next question. From Romel Villaflor, what were the conditions in Cebu province during that time that made it ripe for the revolution?
One, there are many factors that often like contradictory. One thing that can be said is that often it's kind of revolution can be inspired in a time of rising expectations, meaning not because people are so down and out, but because the late 19th century was a time of relative prosperity in Cebu. So obviously, a major factor behind the revolution was not so much because there was widespread famine, poverty, and so on. I mean, the fact that the phenomenon of rising expectations can be fuel for a revolution. And in the case of Cebu, if you think about it, in the late 19th century, the elite of Cebu, in certain ways, you can say they practically controlled Cebu already. They were, because after all, there were residents here. They were the wealthiest families in the Spaniards were in a sense, many of them were here on a tour of duty. There were some businessmen, but mostly the Spanish population was made up of soldiers and civil officials who were here on a term of duty, meaning they probably stay 5 years and then they go back to retire, go back to Spain. So they get rich while they are in office, but the ones who are actually kind of economically controlling the city are locals, mostly Chinese mestizos. The Vilosos, the Osmeñas, the Quiz. In fact, I did an article where I was going through the issues of Bulletin de Cebu. Bulletin de Cebu was published in the 1890s and was the first newspaper in Cebu. And I was leafing through the issues of El Bulletin de Cebu and came across this newspaper article about the celebration of the San Vidal Fiesta, because San Vidal was the patron saint of the city, no, of Cebu City, and it was like the most important holiday in Cebu, because it was not just a religious event. It was also, in a sense, like the city day, meaning the day of the city of Cebu. And so there was a great deal of pomp and pageantry, as well as entertainment. And what caught my attention was one of the highlights of the celebration was a formal dinner that took place in the Ayuntamiento, meaning the city hall, were gathered around the table. It was a very select group, something like 20 or 15 or 20 people. And when I read the item, it struck me that here you have a portrait of who's who in Cebu. I mean, who were the most influential and powerful men in Cebu. So of course there was the Spanish governor. There were like representatives of the Augustinians, the Recollects, meaning the religious, and then kind of one or two Spaniards. But the most there were like kind of Chinese mestizos, meaning they were like, especially the regidores, the councilors, you know, and it almost gives you an idea of who the most powerful. And the fact is that at that point in time, kind of the elite of the city really controlled Cebu already. They were not just local elite, because their influence ranged over the region, because these were merchants who had economic interests in northern Mindanao and in other Visayan islands. I think that was the time when the biggest families in Cebu were not just city or provincial elite; they were really region-wide elite. They had that kind of a status. So that, in fact, you can almost say that one reason why the city elite did not participate at the beginning in the revolution was because why would they revolt? They already controlled the city. Whereas kind of the fact that kind of people were getting to be more educated, and then it was a relatively prosperous times, also raised the expectations of other people. And that's why, like, they felt that what do we need the Spaniards for, you know? And so that's, I think, in the case of Cebu in the 19th century, that was probably a major factor. If you look at who were the leaders of the revolution, that probably was a major factor than kind of economic deprivation and so on. I think their sense of autonomy was such that kind of Spanish rule had become, in a sense, kind of an encumbrance, almost like superfluous. We don't really need them.
Okay, we have actually a lot of questions, Sir Resil, but because, well, in the interest of time, we will be choosing, I'm very sorry, but we have to choose already our questions. And we'll see if Sir would like to answer them offline, especially for those whose questions will not be asked in this webinar. But this will be our last 2 or 3 questions, Sir Resil. This is the next question. From Gaudentia Lantican, sir, it would be good to understand your perspective of the Philippine Revolution in relation to the freedom that we have today. How far have we gone? From the epilogue of your book, A War Never Really Ends. Could you please elaborate on this?
A war never really ends. I think that's a sentence that I had in my book on the war against the Americans. Yeah, that's true. A war never really ends. Kind of, if realities of poverty, injustice, all these kind of remain, then in a way you can say that war never really ends. But speaking just of the Philippine Revolution itself, uh, like the question of like what sorts of freedom did people aspire for? You know? Like for instance, and I suppose it varied according to groups. Like uh, like economic freedom, for instance, probably is not as prominent by and large as political freedom, is that right? In the case of the revolution, but it was the most important consideration, I think, with respect to certain groups. I mentioned the case of the Talisay Minglanilla Augustinian estate. And again, this is one subject that somebody should write about because it's such a major subject, and yet no one has as yet done a good study of the friar lands in Cebu, the Augustinian estate, and and uh, and one aspect in the stories of the revolution that has not really been foregrounded is the participation, I mean the role of agrarian discontent as a factor in the revolution. It's interesting to note, I mentioned Florencio Gonzales, you know, the Surigao who was in Cebu, as a major figure at the beginning of the conspiracy. Florencio Gonzales, the story is that he represented the the tenants of the Talisay Minglanilla estate. They had like a kind of a case against the Augustinians who owned the estate, and that kind of Florencio Gonzales, who was kind of a notary, a lawyer, was representing them in Manila, and in fact, it is said that was the time when he came into contact with revolutionaries in Manila. Potenciano Alino, another prominent leader of the revolution, I think he was a kind of, I don't think he was a lawyer, but he was kind of a escribano, escribiente, like kind of a clerk. And he also was involved in representing tenants of the Augustinian estate in their case. So, I mean, there you have a link between some of the figures in the revolution and the agrarian problem in Talisay Minglanilla. I mean, you'd be surprised. The friar lands, you know, like Manila, Talisay Minglanilla. I mean, it's a huge kind of. I didn't realize that it included like Capitol site and so on. The friar lands in Cebu were really quite extensive, and there were early on, I mean, years before the revolution, already problems in the estates about land grabbing and kind of onerous rents and on the estate, and yet that has not really been foregrounded as a factor in the revolution. And mainly because we have not studied the estate that closely. The University of San Carlos acquired documents from Valladolid in Spain, many of which documents, these are primary kind of documents out in the Augustinian College in Valladolid in Spain, with maps and so on about the friar lands in Cebu. So if anybody would have the capacity to look into Spanish documents, that's a rich source of material. And that's a one subject that still really has to be written about.
That's very interesting, sir, that you mentioned a while ago that the friar lands was also one of the reasons why there was the revolution in Cebu. That would be, I think, another interesting topic for our next webinar, sir. And in any case, let's go to the next question, please. I think we can fit in two more. Here's the second to the last question, sir. From Monig G. Oh, sorry. Junlee Arthur. How are the Cebuano revolutionaries and their leaderships organized? As it seemed, the initial influencers of the revolution left for the other islands in the south.
Yeah, the question is how they were organized. I mean, there are local accounts that speak on this subject. One is a book by Manuel Enriquez de la Calzada, Ang Kagubot sa Sugbo. That's one. The other is Ang Sugbo sa Karaang Panahon by Felix Sales, and so on. So there are accounts there of like the kind of how the conspiracy worked and was organized, and the first set of officials chosen as head of the revolutionary government in Cebu. But as I mentioned, kind of the anti-Spanish revolution actually, in terms of the both the organizing of it and the actual hostilities. You're talking about something that started like if you begin with April 1890, 1898, kind of the Cebuanos took over the government. What the Spaniards left December 1898. Is that right? The Spaniards evacuated from Cebu in April 1898. So in December, evacuated or left Cebu in December 1898. And that was when the revolutionaries entered the city and established, in a sense, a formal government with Luis Flores as the governor. So that's the kind of the time period. And then in February, the Americans came and occupied Cebu. So the Philippine Republic in Cebu, the Republican government in Cebu, lasted only, in a sense, kind of, in terms of like being in the seat of power in Cebu, they lasted only a few months, right? Because after February, I think by April, the Americans had started to occupy the towns in the city. So it continued to exist, but as kind of already kind of out in the field. So there was not really kind of the time span is not that long.
Okay, sir. Let's have our last question. I know sir is probably a little bit tired now, but let's have our last question before we end our Q&A. Our next question, please. Okay. Before we flash our last question, sir, I know there are many whose questions we're not able to accommodate this afternoon. In fact, if we accommodate all your questions, that would be actually another, how do you call this, period or long time. It's like another webinar already, I think, because Sir Resil really the answers of Sir Resil really jump-packed. We get to learn a lot, and there's so many things we still do not know about the revolution, and Sir Resil has actually pointed out which things we should be looking into, and that is why our title is really Unanswered Questions on the Revolution. But here's the last question, sir. From Ryle J. Grate. Good afternoon, Dr. Mojares. Did the revolution in Cebu flourish compared with its counterpart in Luzon, or did it experience the same fate?
Yeah, I think basically kind of the experience was kind of by and large like other places in Luzon. So, but your the thing here is you're speaking actually of two wars. You know, one you have the anti-Spanish Revolution, which started in the case of Cebu, April 1898, and ended December of the same year. Is that right? That's the anti-Spanish Revolution from April to December 1898. The much longer war was the war against the Americans, which you can't call a revolution. Although kind of there are some people who would question it. Kind of Filipinos called the war against the Americans as a war, as a war between two governments and two kind of. There was a Philippine government, you know, in place. So in a sense, it was a war. It was a war in between, in a sense, two nations. It was not a revolution. It was not an insurrection, because a revolution or insurrection means kind of an uprising, kind of a war against the established authorities, isn't it right? So here you have like the Americans invading it. A Philippine Republican government was already in existence. In the case of Cebu, I mean, there was already a provincial government in place, you know, with Luis Flores as the governor. When the Americans kind of threatened bombardment and demanded the surrender of the city. So kind of, so that's no longer a revolution. Although in many ways, kind of there is a continuity between one and the other, right? Between one war and the other. I remember like years ago, I was kind of in Washington, D.C., and as usual, I was kind of busy kind of looking for Philippine books in bookstores. And I was in one bookstore, and the owner, this was kind of an independent, you know, the seller of mostly used old books, and asked me as to what I was interested in, and I said, I'm interested in books on the Philippine insurrection. And he kind of parked with amusement as he said, oh, so you call it Philippine insurrection now? Because during an earlier time, when the American period, it was called the Philippine insurrection. But eventually, like Filipinos kind of changed it from Philippine to the Philippine-American War, because an insurrection means an insurrection against an established authority instead of a war between two governments or two nations. So, I mean, that's kind of what one has to remember. There's a kind of a continuity running through both. But what we went through at the turn of the century, which makes that turn of the century so important in local history, was that you have an anti-Spanish revolution, in a sense, transitioning or changing kind of quickly into a war between the United States and the Philippines.
And with that, we close our Q&A. And we'd like to thank everyone who sent in their questions. I know we couldn't accommodate everyone, but maybe Sir Resil will accommodate another invitation later on to have another webinar on the same topic, and maybe we'll discuss other things that we weren't able to cover this afternoon. But you know, it's such an honor to have Sir Resil Mojares with us this afternoon, national artist Sir Resil Mojares. And because we are so grateful, we'd like to present Sir Resil a certificate. Can we flash, please, the certificate? The certificate of appreciation is given to Dr. Resil B. Mojares for sharing his expertise and time as resource speaker of the webinar, Unanswered Questions on the Revolution in Cebu. And this is on the Gabii sa Kabilin 2021 online activity for June, given this 24th of June at the Rafi, the Kabilin Center, where we are actually streaming from here at the Eduardo Aboitiz Street, Cebu City, signed Miss Amaya Aboitiz Fansler, Rafi President and CEO. Thank you very much, Sir Resil. And we hope we could still invite you for another webinar later on. And we'd like to thank our participants in this webinar, especially the public school teachers. Thank you very much. And the Department of Education Region 7 heads. Of course, we'd like to thank Secretary Leonor Briones, Secretary of Education, for her opening remarks. We'd like to thank also Dr. Salustiano Jimenez, Region 7 Director, Dr. Cristito Eco, Assistant Regional Director, Dr. Maria Jesusa Despojo, CLMD Chief, Dr. Tom Pastor, ESSD Chief, and Dr. Kiriko Sumampong, Regional Education Supervisor for Araling Panlipunan. For those who would like to watch again our webinar on this talk, there are actually, you can actually watch it again on our GSK YouTube page, and we have also our other talks there posted as well. We'd also like to thank all the GSK partners, especially for our partners for this year, and of course, I'd like to thank the GSK Organizing Committee, Rave, Martel, Melka, Verla, Ren, Sig, Mac, and for CRM, for our Customer Relations Management team. Well, we have Faye there, and BDG stakeholder Chad, who is really working hard for our partnership with DepEd. Thank you very much. And we'd like to invite everyone. Also, we have our series of talks actually already lined up for the rest of the year. In July 30, we have this time about food, Spanish influences in Cebuano food, and our speaker will be Miss Luella Alex, our resident food historian here in Cebu. And we have on August 27, Sinulog Dance Variants by Professor Cesar Nimor. And we've invited in September 24, Philippine clothing culture expert, and she's, I think, one of the few who's doing research on clothing, and this is Dr. Stephanie Marie Ku, Spanish influences in Cebuano dressing or clothing. On October 29, it's very interesting. We won't have a webinar, but we'll have a quiz ball, and I hope we'll be able to get students also from the public schools here in Cebu. And on November 26, Cebu Cemeteries as Heritage, and that will be a talk by Dr. Jose Eleazar Barsales. And on December 17, we have our GSK online exhibit. So many things to look forward for GSK. And before we leave, we'd like to invite, for those who are nearby here in Parian, it's actually the fiesta of the patron of Parian, San Juan de Bautista, and we are showcasing Casa Gordo Museum is bringing out its carroza with our century-old San Juan image. And we'd like to invite you, if you want to do duao, you're welcome. We are actually placing our carroza with the images outside until 7 p.m., I believe. So happy fiesta, everyone, especially those in Parian. And with that, we'd like to thank everyone. Daghan kaayong salamat for joining us this afternoon in our webinar. And we hope to see you in our next online activities here at the Gabii sa Kabilin. Thank you and goodbye, everyone. Keep safe.
Thank you so much for sharing your valuable time and for participating in our webinar today. We hope to see you again next month for another Gabii sa Kabilin online activity to appreciate and experience Cebu's culture and heritage. Please don't forget to like our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Again, daghang salamat!